episode of the Cinema Psych podcast. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan. We have a great show for you today. An interesting one, too. One you might not actually think about watching the film, but it is a fantastic piece of fodder for psychology. I want to thank everyone who's listened to the first couple of episodes thus far. It's been great seeing how many shares and likes and listens, getting feedback from everyone. It's been fantastic. Please keep doing that. Please keep sharing the show far and wide. It's awesome. I want to get as many people listening to this as possible. Of course I do. I want to thank a donor since the last time we recorded an episode, Jason Spiegelman, coming in with a solid donation to help us keep moving this show along. Without further ado, let's jump into the episode because we have a lot to talk about. My guest host today is Dr. Marc Klippenstine. He received his Ph.D. and master's degree from York University in Toronto, which is in Canada, of course, in social psych, with a focus in legal decision-making and jury decision-making. I love those two topics. This research examined the role of juror expectations regarding sexual assault victims and the impact of the adjudication of the case through the legal system. He is currently department chair and professor of psychology at East Central University. His research and teaching interests include forensic psychology, physiological psychology, and he teaches the research and statistic courses at both the graduate and undergraduate levels. He has been at ECU since 2007 and is the current chair of the IRB committee. Hey, me too. He and his partner also run a polled, I hope I'm saying that right, Hereford cattle farm, and have an 18-month at home. So he's got his hands full. Mark, go ahead and say hi to everyone.
Hello, everyone. You actually did pretty good. It's polled Hereford, so that's pretty good.
Okay, polled. Okay, sounds good. So how's it going?
Everything's well. It is a busy time of year. It's our fair season, and it's busy at work. The beginning of a new semester. And so it's all fantastic. I'm enjoying the work and the home aspects, and everything is jiving pretty well. So, which is good. I've been having a good time.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you're with me today to talk about a great film. But before we get to the film, I just want to know a little bit more about you. Let's have the listeners find out a little more about you. So the first thing that I'm going to be asking all of my guest hosts is, what do you love about film?
Film for me has always represented family time. A time when I get to spend time with those people that are important in my life. Whether that be my son when we're watching, a cartoon, or my wife in a favorite movie we watch. Or even growing up, watching movies with my parents and watching movies with my brother. It has always been about family time, and I've really enjoyed that aspect of film. And so, or hanging out just with my friends too. It's included family and friends, and so I really have enjoyed that component of film. Just as an example of that, when I was growing up, and this kind of dates me a little bit, but, this is in the time when VCRs, they were kind of expensive, so you didn't have them in your home necessarily. And we were definitely not able to afford one. And so during special occasions, we would rent a VCR for a birthday. And my mom would let us rent as many movies as we wanted. And so we'd rent all those fantastic 80s movies like The Goonies or, anything starring Stallone or Schwarzenegger, all those action movies. And we just watched them over and over and over again. And that just really became a large part of my childhood. And some of my best memories were, going and renting that videotape, and then eventually DVDs, either with my brother or my family. As I grew up and really growing up watching all those different movies. So all of that brings me back to and connects me to my past and my current, life. Me and my wife still refer to a lot of movie lines in our day-to-day activities. A lot of Ace Ventura lines are lines from some of our favorite movies make it into our daily day-to-day conversations. And, it really is just a neat part of how film connects people is you can say a movie line and everybody knows what you're talking about that's seen that movie with you. And it became an experience, a moment of memory. And that's my favorite part of what movies represent and what film can bring to the classroom. Just as another example, me and my brother would go rent movies, and that was the time we got to drive the car around. And so we would often try to go to the farthest movie rental place that we could in town, sometimes 20 minutes away. And I'm sure they had those movies at the movie store, 5 minutes away, but it's a time for us to hang out and get in the car and have a little bit of freedom and independence. And that really helped me grow up. It was a part of my coming of age. You see that a lot in the movies, and it's not much different in real life. You really do develop and become connected to those parts of the media and the environment that you're exposed to while you're growing up during that time. So building on all that, that's kind of why I've always wanted to bring film into the classroom, is I want students to feel that connection. This is their coming of age. And so if I can put a movie and connect it to a psychological concept, then they're going to remember that concept when they see that movie for the rest of their lives. And that's something that I can have a very powerful impact and powerful influence on them. And I try to use my powers for good, and teach them something that I want them to know about, teach them something that I think is relevant to them being a good member of society.
Sure. And that sort of jumps me into the next film is, so you mentioned just then that you do combine film and teaching because of the familial aspects. So now you do that. What do you want your students to get from you doing that?
I think, and that's a great question, is I want them to get that psychology is everywhere. Psychology is in everything around us. It is part of every part of our life. And you see it in movies, you see it in the media, you see it everywhere, and they're making that connection. I want them to know that psychology is in their home, it's in the movie theaters, it's all around them, it's in the media. And that is really important for me to get across to them, because they may not remember the definition of this concept or that concept, but they will remember that psychology is everywhere.
Yeah, that's actually my reasons for putting films in my classes. I haven't really said much about it in any of the other episodes, but I want to have them see where that psychology is everywhere. And this art medium is just one of the many places. So yeah, awesome.
I think psychology, can help bridge that gap between me and my students. There's that generational gap that keeps getting bigger and bigger, and goes back to that, general, joke that, college students stay the same age, but professors keep getting older and older. Or at least I keep getting feeling out like I'm getting older and older. But I can bridge that gap. If I watch a movie that they watch, if I watch one of those popular movies and I talk about it and I use it as an example, then I've made that connection. I can see them go, hey, this is someone who understands me. This is someone who is interested in something I'm interested in. And if I can make that connection, I got them. And then I can talk about concepts and definitions and structures and ideas and t-tests, whatever it is. And yes, I do use film even in films even in statistics, but a lot of it is just trying to make that connection. It really truly is all about that connection. If I can make that connection, it's priceless. It's more, it provides more give back to me and to them than anything else I can do in the classroom if I can make that connection. And that is why film is so great, because every person's idea of film is different and everyone makes that connection in a different way, but yet it still works, and it works across all those different formats. The simplest way I can say it is it really does make me connected to them and them connected to me, but it also makes psychology part of everything. And it's really that double whammy, that combo effect that I love about using movies in the classroom.
Now, I mentioned very briefly some of the research that you do. Do you have anything currently going on with research? I know you're busy with doing a lot of other stuff, but
research is still a part of what I do, but I'm at a teaching college. The primary goal of what I do is to teach classes. And even as department chair, with a little bit of release time, I'm still teaching a lot of classes, and I'm usually overloaded because we're usually short staffed. And so a large part of what I do in terms of research is the supervision of student research. Master's theses, I'm doing one of those right now, and I'm working on, every year I seem to have an honors thesis project or two. And then I teach the statistics, writing and design, and experimental psych rotation, where I get students through 3 classes. And through those, I teach them the research experience. So they learn how to do statistics, they learn how to design an experiment, and then they get to run an experiment. And these are student-run experiments from beginning to end. It's a great way for me to connect. Another great way for me to connect with students, and includes, them engaging in their own research and their own ideas, and me kind of guiding them through that process. And I still try to engage in a little bit of my own research here and there, but it has shifted a lot to student supervision of research as opposed to conducting my own research. When I do get to do my own research, it tends to focus on those expectations and expectancies that occur in the legal system, particularly as jurors, hear a story or particularly about, victims. And I focus primarily on sexual assault victims, their expectations and beliefs regarding that victim and their behavior, and how that influences their adjudication through the judicial system. And it's interesting perspective, because a lot of it has to do with beliefs which have a negative impact on that victim, but which shouldn't. And so that's an expectations and series of beliefs which influence their case, sometimes in a very negative way. And I try to get involved in such a way so that I'm studying that process and then trying to get that information out so that we can help victims and help them through that process.
Excellent. And that is with a focus on the American justice system, I imagine.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. Is actually started, currently, most of what I do is on the American legal system. But when I started, it was taking a specifically Canadian legal context. And a lot of the research I had done was replication of stuff that happened in a U.S. environment, and then taking it and spinning it towards the Canadian legal system. It was a little bit of a challenge learning that difference between the two, but I was kind of more trained in the Canadian perspective, and now kind of taken to applying it to that U.S. legal system. Definitely when I moved back down here, I definitely focused a lot more on that American legal context, and try to jump off from that perspective. there was a lot of challenges when I made that switch over between the two, because there's a lot of terms and stuff that are different, a lot of different procedural effects, and obviously case law is different. And so it was a bit of a challenge, but it was a neat challenge. And now that I've kind of got things switched over, I think I would have difficulty going back to that original situation, or that Canadian context, I guess.
Yeah, I kind of had to redo some work to get.
Yes, definitely. Took a little bit to kind of get back up and running with those materials and get everything working in a way that fit this environment versus that environment.
So, what film do you have for us today, Mark?
Well, it is one of my favorite films, and has a couple things that I really love about it. It has my favorite actor, and it's one that I can easily show on class. It is pretty innocuous in terms of content, so there's not a lot of language or other warnings that I have to let students know about, and we can just enjoy that film. The movie is Castaway, starring Tom Hanks.
Castaway. Tom Hanks, directed by Robert Zemeckis, came out in the year 2000.
Yeah, also dates me, particularly when I pick those older films. It's actually at a point where, a lot of my students weren't even born yet when this movie was made. So really does put some date on me as a professor.
Tom Hanks looks great in it. Rewatched it recently, and he looks fantastic. I mean, he doesn't really age much, but he looks great in that film.
Yes, he does. I rewatched the movie between yesterday and today. Don't really ever get to watch a movie straight through anymore with a toddler around. Right. So it's usually, spits and spurts as I get through it. But it still holds up. I still think it's a great movie.
And for those who are not familiar with Castaway, I don't know how you couldn't be familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't, it is the story of a man named Chuck Nolan, played by Tom Hanks, and he is I want to say systems manager for FedEx, the logistics company. And his life is all about being on time, or think time. Time is a major theme in the film, and he is dating a graduate student. And before we jump into some of the psychology, I have to say, as a former graduate student, and Mark as a former graduate student, but probably more in line with your experiences than mine, she had to print or copy her dissertation because the beginning of the film is set in 1995. So early days of the internet. She had to copy her dissertation. Wow.
Yeah. This is a little bit off topic, but I actually remember faxing my dissertation to my supervisor. I had already moved out to Oklahoma, so we were still working on things, and sending it via fax so I could get corrections and changes in a more timely fashion than mailing it, I guess.
Yeah, it was an early haha moment. Anyways, this graduate student, her name is Kelly, and she is played by Helen Hunt. And really, those are the two main names in the film. There are other supporting characters, but really it's Tom Hanks and Helen Hunt. And like I said, the film is directed by Robert Zemeckis. And on the way to a FedEx, I guess, new office or some other office in another country to speed them up because they suck, because apparently that's his job, to speed up FedEx offices that suck. His plane crashes into the ocean, and he is stranded for a while on a small outcropping island that I just could not suspend my disbelief every time I watched it, how this island with foliage and everything on it and usable land was not settled or known about. So that was odd. But he's there for a while, and then you get great scenes. I'll play for you a scene about him making fire in a little bit, among other things. But we're going to explore, Mark and I, we're going to explore an aspect of the film which blew my mind when he first suggested this, because honestly, I hadn't thought about it. Mark, what is that aspect?
Problem solving. It's a large chunk of the movie is just him solving problems. A large part of that first and second act is him solving problems relating to being on an island. It's one of the most pressure that you could be under to solve problems. Yeah,
it's being stranded by yourself on an island. You're going to solve some problems or you're going to die.
It really is just incredibly high pressure to get something accomplished. Survival, you have to survive. So very high pressure situations.
Right. Now, you and I, like we said, we both rewatched the film, and you had mentioned the problem solving aspect to me several weeks ago. And when I rewatched it, I watched it with that lens, and we were making notes on this film, and we basically came to similar conclusions, but you had a differing viewpoint from I'll say you had a different viewpoint from my total viewpoint, though you did share some of my analysis. So what I want to do is pit those two ideas together, or pit them against each other, let's say, and not so that they're one's wrong and one's right, or one's better than the other, but that they're two different ideas about problem solving that I think this film really can carry both of them. So what is your general idea about problem solving in this film?
For me, the problem solving in this movie kind of takes on a Gestalt approach. Mm-hmm. This idea that the sum of the parts is mm-hmm. greater than the whole, kind of concept. It starts with this idea that you have to kind of represent this problem idea in your mind. And then you kind of have to restructure that problem to be able to come up with solutions to it. And so it's kind of both of those aspects playing off each other, that restructuring and representation kind of going back and forth as you kind of come across this problem idea. You're on a desert island and you need water to survive. So you have to reorganize and restructure that concept of what water is or what you can drink, and then try to solve that problem from that point. And we'll talk about this, and I think we'll talk about this in a little bit. But using coconuts to obtain that water, or rather, something to drink. This idea that, you need water. I don't have water. How can I restructure and reorganize my environment to solve this problem, to come up with a solution that will let me survive this situation? Kind of taking this concept idea of, the problem idea, and looking at it in a whole way, and looking at those pieces in such a way that when you put them together, you're recreating and restructuring something that wasn't necessarily there to begin with. And this approach specifically has a couple big problems that you often see where you're trying to solve these problems. And those kind of relate to functional fixedness is one of them. and mental set is the other one. And so both that functional fixedness and mental set kind of play together and kind of get in the way of successfully solving problems sometimes. This is, these are things that are hindrances that I see regularly and daily in our lives. We have a cattle farm, and so a lot of what we end up having to do is take something that was made for one purpose and use it for something else. This idea that I've fixed a lot of stuff with baling wire, and that was not its intended purpose, but yet it works for that situation. So when you're looking at functional fixedness, it's this idea that it's a hindrance because people hold certain objects as having a particular function. And sometimes it's difficult to use it for a function that is not its intended purpose because you are so locked in on the idea that it can only be used for one of its original intended purpose. And so there is this hindrance that occurs in this situation. So if you have an idea of what you can do with something, that can sometimes cause a hindrance in your ability to use it for something else. Unless you can break that functional fixedness and get beyond that, sometimes you're trapped in that idea of what that tool can be used with or can be used for.
A good example that many psychology students will see and maybe the lay public might be familiar with is Dunker's famous matches and the candles problem. Participants were given a scene and they were told, here are your materials for making a shelf that the candle can stand and be lit. And in one scenario, they are told that it's a box of matches. And in another scenario, they're just told that they have they have matches and the candles. And in the first condition, the one where they're told they have a box of matches, they can't get past the fixedness of that is a box of matches. But in the other condition where they're just told they have matches, they quickly see that they can make a shelf out of the box that the matches come in. And so that's an example of the functional fixedness of the box of matches that many students are told about Dunker's research back in the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah, I love that example. It's one I frequently use in class because I think it's just a great example of how we problem solve. One of the ones that was brought up to me from a student is they were talking about taking the door off the hinges. And so they get that first pin out of the hinge because there's no weight on the door. It's all level and everything's good, and get that first pin out. And then for the next 20 minutes, they're trying to find something that will pop out that other pin in the bottom part of the door. And it took them forever to figure out that, hey, I'm holding something that fits perfectly in that hinge, the pin that I just took out. And it's just a great example of that functional fixedness idea.
Wow, that's actually really good.
I'm just thinking, man, that's a great example. And he's holding this thing that is used to hold the door together. This pin is used to hold the door together, not necessarily as something that is used to take the door apart. Just a perfect example of a real life example of how this happens. This has just always been an example that has stuck in my mind as a perfect example of functional fixedness and a functional idea is that the function that you use something for really sets how you want to use that object in the future.
Right.
It leads you to literally wanting to do out of the box thinking, trying to think of other ways that you can use these objects.
Right. That is a good life hack there. So what are the aspects of the problem solving with this Gestalt idea in mind that are presented in the film? Do you have any examples of those?
Yeah, I mean, there is a large chunk of the movie at the beginning part of that movie, probably a good 40 minutes, where he is doing nothing but solving problems. It's one of my favorite parts of the movie to watch because all you hear is the sound of the waves and the wind, and you're just in Chuck's mind as he's there solving problems. It feels like you're there because there's no dialogue. It's just objects and him trying to solve things. It all comes down to, it feels like you're there in this quiet headspace with him, which is how we tend to solve problems. Sometimes we're solving problems with other people, but a lot of times our problem solving is by ourselves, in those moments of quiet where we're trying to come up with these solutions. Just as examples from the movie, he's on the island and FedEx stuff starts to wash up on the island. And he finally decides to open up these boxes, and he starts to gather around what he finds. And, it's stuff like a dress, where there's this leather corset part and a fishnet. And at first he thinks, what am I going to do with this stuff? Which he eventually turns the fishnet part into an actual fishing net, and uses it to catch fish. Or, he uses VCR tapes, again, something that doesn't seem like it's very useful on a deserted island. But he uses that to create rope and tape. And it's just a perfect example of how he kind of breaks the functional fixedness that exists in these objects in order to come up with ideas and ways to use them that can help him to survive. Both of these things just really demonstrates his ability to take an object and turn it around from what its intended function is and use it for something which is really beneficial for him to get off the island. I don't know what he would have done if a bunch of DVDs would have washed up, if that would have been the thing. I said maybe you could have used them for reflective, help sign or something. But, the VCR turned into good rope, and the fishnet turned into his ability to catch food.
What about the coconut scene?
Another example of this is the coconuts. These coconuts come in these big giant husks, and so he's got to peel that stuff off to be able to get inside. So at first he's throwing these coconuts against the wall and nothing's really happening. And so then he finds some of that probably volcanic rock or something that's sharp, and uses that to kind of bust into the husk and is able to peel it back and builds, smashing it with a rock, and the rock shatters and turns into a stone axe. And then that stone axe he uses to cut and chop into that husk. And then he finally, gets the husk off. And so now he's left with the innards of a coconut, and it's just that coconut shell. So then he immediately throws it against the rock wall, thinking, okay, this is it. I'm going to get in there. And it busts all open and spills everything all over the place. Well, he's got the meat. He kind of lost out on that fluid. So very quickly he feels like he just wasted his, efforts to bust in there. And so now he has to try again. And he takes some of the other pieces of rock that were left there, smaller pieces, and then for the next coconut gets the husk off, does all that, and then uses that to kind of drill a hole. And then he can get at that coconut water, coconut milk, that, allows him to get something to drink before he was able to start collecting water. Just another great example of just working outside the box, trying to break that functional fixedness for tools and ideas, and trying to get something that helps him survive on that island. It's a perfect example of how, sometimes a little finesse in problem solving as opposed to frustration, with throwing that coconut against the wall, can help him kind of solve that problem of, I need something to drink. I don't have anything to drink. And using that little bit of finesse to solve that problem to get some fluid.
Right. Yeah. And then what about the fire scene?
Yes, the fire scene. One of my favorites in the movie. The fire building scene kind of involves mental set a little bit more than functional fixedness, because he had been trying to solve it using the same methods that he had used in the past. So, we all think of building a fire by taking a stick and having it perpendicular to the ground and then, rubbing our hands across it, spinning that stick. And when he does this, and he does it all day long, because, we start and we see him in the day, and at night he hasn't succeeded. And in fact, at one point he, cuts his hand, and there's blood and other things, and he's frustrated and all that stuff's going on. And he can't create fire. He can't get that fire to be created using that previous mental set of how he thought you should build a fire, of that preconception of how you should do that. So at this point, his hands are sore, they're cut, and he goes back to that coconut to eat, and he's using that stone axe to kind of saw the meat of that coconut. And then at that point, as he's like sawing and he stops, it's like you can see that aha moment, that epiphany, that kind of, I got it, kind of pop in his head. And he's like, I've been doing this the wrong way the whole time. I shouldn't be spinning that stick. I should be pushing that stick. And rubbing the stick through a pushing motion seems to be a more efficient way for him to get more pressure and to build up the heat necessary for him to be able to, start a fire. And it works just by changing that mental set, changing what he thought was the right way of doing it into a way that actually did work. All in all, it's just really is that perfect example of, trying to solve a problem one way, realizing it doesn't work, and then using an analogy from something else to say, I should be doing it like this, and then very quickly solving that problem, coming to that very quick resolution as you're trying to solve this problem.
Right. And I'm going to go ahead and play that scene just because this is pure Tom Hanks. And then we'll come back to talking more about Gestalt problem solving.
The air got to it. The air got to it! I did it. Fire! There you go! Light it up! Come on! The torn of the dead and through! Ouch! Ouch! The torn and water in the fire! Runner, we can only lose! Let's go! We couldn't get much higher! Come on, baby, light my fire! There you go! Here you go! It's a signal fire! Let's go, Bob! Earth dollars! Oh! The meteor shower! Fireflies, go, run! You're free, you're free! Yeah! Yes! Look what I have created! I have made fire! I have made fire!
All right. I think there are a couple of other notes that you had for Gestalt on this one, and it has to do with how defined the problem is. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, when you look at the kinds of problems we come across in our day-to-day lives, you kind of see that there are really two main categories that we come across, ill-defined problems and well-defined problems. Well-defined problems have a solution that if you follow the correct procedure, you'll come up with the answer. Math is a perfect example of a well-defined problem. If you follow the operands in the formulas and follow the procedures, you'll come up with the answer. But not all problems are like that. Some problems are ill-defined problems, and those ill-defined problems are more things that you start at point A and you need to get to point B, but how do you get from one to the other? And sometimes it's difficult to know the solution to get from point A to point B, to solve that next stage. When you look at a lot of the things that happen on the island and the problems that he's solving, they are well-defined problems. Once I figure out how to throw a spear and catch a fish, I'll have something to eat. So that is a very straightforward problem for him to solve. A lot of the problems on the island are also ill-defined problems. This idea where I know I had to get from A to B, but how do I do it? How do I get from one to the other? And if you think about it, the biggest one is just getting off the island. He knows that he's on the island, and how do you get off? How do you make that jump and that leap from one place to the next?
Yeah, the major ill-defined problem.
It's kind of the key. What ill-defined problem of the entire movie, it's how do I get off the island? It ties into stuff like how do I get past those breaking waves because they're keeping me and pushing me back on? How do I store enough water that I can take with me so I won't die immediately of thirst? What is the best time of year to try to make it off the island? Because there's those trade winds that shift at a particular time of the year. All of those go into helping him solve that ill-defined problem, but it's things that he doesn't even know yet until he's been there long enough. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so eventually he, creates a calendar using that hole in the cave and can chart the time. He maps the wind and when it's going to change based on that calendar. All of that goes into him solving, that ill-defined problem. Of how you get off the island. It's part of that big package of solving something which is not easy to solve. When you think about it, we in academia live in that world of an ill-defined problem. We have students, for example, who know they want to have a career in psychology, but how do they accomplish that? How do they find out what they want to do? How do they find that career that they want to spend the rest of their life doing? And I think in a lot of ways that students connect with this idea of the ill-defined problem in the movie and can use that analogy of, you're stuck on a desert island. How do I get off? It's not that much different for them when they're trying to think of their careers is, I know what I want to do. How do I make a career out of this? And I think they make that connection pretty handedly when we watch this movie. In fact, I try to connect those points for him even by saying, imagine that this university is an island and you're trying to get off the island. How do you get off the island? And it helps them. At least I feel it helps them. I think it really does help when they rephrase this concept of what are they doing there and what do they want to do in the future and how do you connect those points? Those are just a few examples that come to mind of how you can kind of use that conception of ill-defined and well-defined problems and how you can build it into discussions and jumping off points for your discussions with your students.
I like the example that you tell your students. How are you going to get off the island? I love it, especially if they're Survivor fans, right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Although I guess it's not a good idea to get off the island in Survivor. I mixing metaphors here. Okay, that does. I mean, these are all great points about Gestalt, and I love teaching my students about Gestalt problem solving because of the wealth of examples that you can get them to actively be engaged in. It's fantastic. But when I was watching the film, after you told me about the problem solving aspect, I was coming at it from a different perspective. And a lot of the times, Gestalt and the information processing approach are discussed in cognitive psych classes, even problem solving classes. So you essentially talk about the Gestalt and reframing and restructuring. But when I was watching the film, the problem solving aspect was the information processing approach. And this is about the search for a solution, moving from a initial state to a goal state, but also conceptualizing the problem space in between those two states, right? And so this was first identified and discussed by Newell and Simon, two guys who were super fans of computers. And so this is why this is called the information processing approach, because it's using the idea that your brain is a computer. So the main, I would say I had two particular examples going through this when I was watching the film again. So I actually will recast your examples of the coconut and the fire. I saw those both as an initial state and a goal state, right? The initial state of the coconut was that it was whole, hard to get into. And the goal state is that I want some of that sweet, sweet coconut milk, right? And so he had to figure out how to get from a whole coconut to a coconut that was open, that where he could get the meat of the coconut and where he could drink the coconut water. Because at that point, he didn't have any sources of fresh water. The only thing he had was salt water. So he had to go through a bunch of intermediate states in the problem space to get from the initial to the goal. And those are represented by the aspects of the scene, like throwing it against the wall. That's not working. Smashing a blunt rock against it. That's not working. Realizing that when he smashed the rock, that it created a sort of a wedge shape, like an axe. And realizing that an axe is better than a blunt force against it, because you can get that sharp edge of the wedge into a groove on the husk. And then he opened it, finally was able to get into it, but he opened it with such force that all of the water spilled out of it. I mean, luckily he had some food with the meat of the coconut, but still had to move from one state to the next. So that's how I viewed that one. Similarly, with the fire example, he has to move from an initial state, no fire, to a goal state, having fire, and being able to solve those, being able to move from one state to the next in the problem space, in the intermediate space, is figuring out that, his hands moving from back and forth, making the stick spin wasn't working. And then realizing, as you said, that the movement of the saw on the coconut could be used on the wood is an intermediate state. And then realizing that he needed more air when he saw the smoke, another intermediate state, because he didn't have fire yet. It was just smoke. And so he realized that he needed to get more air underneath the combustion point, where he had his little kindling in the wedge of wood. And then he moved on to another intermediate state and eventually put more kindling on it. And then he had fire, right? And all of those moves from intermediate state to intermediate state within the approach to this problem solving, the information processing approach, they're called operators. And those are the permissible moves, right? And so a non-operator in the fire example would be like, well, let me just throw some water on it. That's not going to help you move from one intermediate state to another. You have to realize that, oh, I need more air for this mixture to work a little bit better, right? So that's what I saw in several of the other scenes, was this information problem solving approach. But after you've described the Gestalt, I'm also in agreement that those are great. That's a great way to look at it too. And that's the beauty of it, I guess. Why you use this one in your class is because you could talk about both and not be wrong and still blow everyone's minds.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm just kind of, thinking of this now as we're talking, it's a great example of how different theories explain the same behavior, and how you can kind of maybe use this as an example in like a research class, or as to how you can come up with different theories and different answers to the same question that still answer the question, but they use different ways to get to that end state, that end idea of what is being the correct answer. Maybe not correct answer, but the answer that seems to answer part of that problem. It's a great thing that bring forth to students and put into their minds is that, not only are there different ways to explain different theories that explain what's happening on the island, but it's how science works. Science works by coming up with competitive theories or competing theories as to how things make sense, or how the world works. The reality is that there's not always the same answer for the same behavior, and that just is a fact of science. And the fact is that both theories can be good at explaining the theories and bits and pieces of what's happening in terms of problem solving.
Right. It really is. This is why I had to say at the beginning of the episode, this is wild. This is not a film that most people think about for using in psychology. Wild.
That's kind of the reaction I get from students when I say, hey, we're going to watch Castaway in class as a way to talk about problem solving. And I dedicate 3 days in class to go through and watch this movie together with them.
Okay.
And, it's a 2.5 hour movie, and it's just part of that experience. It comes at a point in the semester where they're just ready for a break. We're all ready for a break. And I just love their reactions as we watch this movie together. Ultimately, because we're watching it together, it really does create this collaborative group effect by experiencing the same stuff at the same time, something that they can talk about in terms of these concepts, hopefully for the rest of their life when they think about them. Just overall, a really great example of how you can use film in class and movies that you might not even think about using. You can look at them and take an eye from what do I see from a psychology perspective in this film that I can use to demonstrate principles to my students.
Yeah, that's great. This needs to be added, by the way. I'm probably going to go add this, or at least tell them. This needs to be added to the Indiana University or Purdue University list of cognitive science films, because I don't think it's on there.
Yeah, that's cool. That's awesome.
And it's a great. It's great. It has to be added to that. People will cycle through that list and be like, "Wait, what? I'm sorry, what? Castaway? No." This is not cognitive science.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just they're going to be like, the movie with the guy on an island by himself. That's cognitive psych. How's that possible?
Yeah, a FedEx guy. What is this about FedEx and cognitive science? No, I don't believe you. So that's the cognitive science aspect of the film. But there are some social psych themes that we both picked up on. I said at the top of the show, as we were talking about, as I was introducing the film, one of the themes of the film is time and not having enough or not using it appropriately. You see that with the relationship between Chuck and Kelly, the latter not using it appropriately. And then Chuck is all about, efficiency and says these really crass things about, being on time and making sure that you do things in the quickest amount of time. So time is a big theme of the film. And I think that from a filmmaker's standpoint, that is what Robert Zemeckis wanted you to gather. But I think there is another aspect to the time theme, which is relationships. So, Mark, you had brought up some really good points about this in our note taking. What's the relationships aspect of Castaway?
Yeah, one of the big ones for me is the creation of Wilson. Wilson is the volleyball that he finds on the island when he's,
right,
gathering up all those FedEx packages and opening them. And during that scene where he's building fire, he cuts his hand. I think I mentioned that earlier. And in that moment of frustration, he takes that volleyball and, slams it against the wall, that rock wall. And in doing so, creates Wilson, by creating what looks to be like a face on this volleyball. And so just by having a bloody hand and, throwing that volleyball against the wall, he creates a friend. He creates a confidant for him on this lonely and for his lonely travels on this island. It does a couple of things. It's a great movie making device. It's quiet for a large part of the movie. And so it allows dialogue to occur. I'm not typically a big fan of exposition in movies, but it works in this one. So it kind of moves that plot forward and allows him to discuss things in a way so we know what's going on, because it's quiet. There's no thought, there's no dialogue, there's no conversation without someone else being there. And Wilson provides that something else. And it works in such a way that Wilson gives us a reason for Chuck to talk to somebody. We all know that when we're sitting around completely alone, a lot of times we don't talk to ourselves. And so it's not realistic to think that someone's just sitting there explaining everything out loud. I mean, that might happen a little bit, but the Wilson character creates a way to do this that makes logical sense for the movie. The creation of Wilson kind of solves another problem for him. He needs social interaction. I take an evolutionary perspective on this, in the sense that, we evolve to have a social component to our lives, and we crave it, we desire it, we miss it when it's gone, we go out of our way to develop it. Ultimately we are social creatures at our core, and we need that social belonging to make us whole. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, whether it's through social media or in person, we need to be around other people. It's just that simple. We find ways to do that. And for Chuck, he, created Wilson to fill that need. And in society, we see that when that need is not met, bad things happen. So in this moment of frustration, Wilson is created, and it creates someone who he can bounce ideas off of. He can, have conversations. It's someone who acts as his logic person. So Wilson becomes, this friend, and ultimately a piece of himself that kind of seems to be pulled out and placed into Wilson, someone that he can debate with and logic with and try to solve problems with, really is just a piece of Chuck that's created. So someone that he can argue with and come up with solutions. At one point he's arguing about how much rope is left on the island with Wilson. And he treats Wilson as if he is not an inanimate object, but is as real as us conversing or having an argument with any of our friends. He has debates with Wilson. He argues with Wilson over the best way to get off of the island. Wilson is as much of a character in this movie as anybody else is. One of the things I when rewatching the movie I saw was at one point he's in the cave and he has a fight with Wilson. He argues with him and then he gets frustrated and he throws Wilson out the cave entrance. And then he immediately regrets it. Not much different than what would happen if we had an argument with a loved one or a friend. A lot of times you say things in that heated moment that you wish you hadn't said. And so he immediately tries to go out and find Wilson, because he's sorry. He's sorry that he said those things and he wants to kind of ask for forgiveness, from Wilson. It's kind of a perfect example of what happens during an argument where, you might walk away from a loved one in a heated argument and then immediately regret doing so. And he tries to correct what he did wrong. He tries to right that wrong with Wilson. All of this really, to me, demonstrates this really strong social components of this movie, and it's done through an inanimate object. I just think that's amazing and powerful filmmaking.
Yeah, I definitely agree about the piece of Chuck becomes Wilson. It's as you said, it's a movie making device, but also we do it in our own lives. We give our pets, they're not inanimate, but we give our pets names. We talk to them. We give them voices. I know I give my dog a voice. So we speak for them, right? And when you're growing up, you have dolls or you have action figures or something, and you speak for them too. You create different personas and stuff, and that is a part of you being able to explore aspects of your life as something else. And I think Wilson represents, one thing, it represents a way for Chuck to not be lonely. And he acts as though Wilson's going to reply back right back to him. But really it's Chuck's own voice replying back to him. Right. And it's very striking when he throws Wilson out of the cave, and then he goes out there and he's like, Wilson, where are you? Nobody's going to say anything back to him. He could have lost Wilson on the island because he couldn't find him. Wilson's not going to say anything. And I think that really puts a pin in the escape.
I love that part of the movie.
He eventually does lose Wilson.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt there. I rewatched that scene again today, specifically that scene, and one of the things that was really powerful for me was it's the only scene in the movie where they show Chuck crying is when he loses Wilson.
I did not pick that up.
He doesn't cry when he gets stranded on the island. They show him getting frustrated and being upset, but they don't show him shedding tears. He lays on that raft and sheds tears because Wilson is gone. It's just a very powerful part of the movie, and when I caught that today, I just thought, man, he doesn't cry in any other part of this movie. He is truly upset that Wilson is gone. he doesn't cry when he loses Kelly. He doesn't cry when he comes back, but he cries when he loses Wilson. And, it's probably because it's because he's losing a piece of himself. It really comes down to this idea that he's leaving a piece of himself out there in the ocean that was represented by Wilson, and he's crying because of everything that it took to get him to that point, and losing Wilson is that transition to surviving. It's just a very powerful scene in the movie, and one that I won't ever look at the same again.
Yeah. And this jumps us into the other social aspect of the film, which is the relationship that he had with Kelly that he ultimately loses. Sorry, spoiler alert. He spent 4 years on the island. They thought he was dead. I did like that. Oh, what did you bury? Oh, things.
Yeah, I know they talk about like burying his pager and his cell phone. And the pagers really date this movie again too.
Yeah. Your stuff. Oh, pager dates the movie. I mean, the movie starts in 1995, so it makes a ton of sense. But yeah, they come back in 2000, and people are like, pagers. What are pagers? But there's a great scene at the end. It's essentially Tom Hanks monologuing about the theme of loss. And I think if he hadn't lost Wilson, he would not have come to this realization about losing Kelly. So I'm going to go ahead and play that scene for you all, and we'll come back and discuss the loss.
We both had done the math, and Kelly added it all up. Knew she had to let me go. I added it up. Knew that I'd lost her. Because I was never going to get off that island. I was going to die there. Totally alone. I was going to get sick, or I was going to get injured or something. The only choice I had, the only thing I could control was when and how and where that was going to happen. So I made a rope. And I went up to the summit to hang myself. I had to test it, of course. You know me. And the weight of the log snapped the limb of the tree. So I couldn't even kill myself the way I wanted to. I had power over nothing. That's when this feeling came over me like a warm blanket. I knew somehow that I had to stay alive. Somehow. I had to keep breathing, even though there was no reason to hope. And all my logic said that I would never see this place again. So that's what I did. I stayed alive. I kept breathing. And then one day that logic was proven all wrong because the tide came in, gave me a sail. And now here I am. I'm back. voice talking to you. I have ice in my glass. And I've lost her all over again. I'm so sad that I don't have Kelly. But I'm so grateful that she was with me on that island. And I know what I have to do now. Gotta keep breathing. Because tomorrow the sun will rise. Who knows what the tide could bring?
Mark, what do you think about that scene?
You know, I think it's one of my favorite scenes. It's one that just stands out to me as a very powerful scene in the movie. You know, it's his realization about what he went through. It's it's very powerful because he talks about suicide in that scene. You know, he talks about not having control of anything in his life on that island. You know, he can't control getting off the island. He can't control getting back to the person he loves. He's trapped on that island, but he feels like he can have control of the moment of his death. And it's very, it's a very realistic, I think, portrayal of probably something that everyone would go through on that island. Just in terms of how they understand their place in that environment and what they might be thinking of to deal with it. You know, it ultimately comes down to this idea in Chuck's mind, I think, that the only thing he had control of was deciding if and when and how he was going to die. And, Chuck, being Chuck, in the movie, as we learn through his character, goes through the process of testing, coming up with an experiment to test a technique, and it fails. And he's alive and survives because it does fail. Ultimately, he said he didn't want to hurt himself and suffer on the island. He wanted to make that final decision. And if that was the final way he was going to go, then he was going to, end his life that way. It's kind of a mental math part of the movie where, in Chuck's mind, he's kind of adding all this stuff up and coming to a conclusion. And I haven't used it yet for this purpose, but I think the next time I show this movie, I think it would be a great place to jump off on a discussion of suicide, and maybe have, we have a great suicide prevention team on campus and bring them in and have discussions about those thought processes and how we can help them deal with those things. Because I think people not just on desert islands have these thoughts. And so, what can we do to help those individuals? What can we do to be aware of that? And how can we help with their mental math so that it doesn't equal that ultimate solution that they think will solve things?
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, actually. The suicide prevention as a piece to this, because and I didn't come to that realization either until you just said it. And I think that's because you're not actually focused on that while he's trapped on the island. It's only afterward that you realize that he felt hopeless and he wanted to do something about it. And I think that has some really significant parallels with just regular, plain old, non-stranded suicidal ideation. Yeah. Well, those are the two main aspects of the film that I think we both picked up on. But before we end, I think we had a couple of just random notes about the film that we wanted to share with our listeners here. So one of your favorite films was the dental work scene. Walk us through that one.
Yeah, that's a great scene. At the very beginning of the movie, he's at that Christmas dinner and he's kind of complaining about a toothache. And he says he really needs to go see his dentist, and I think his dentist's name is Dr. Spaulding, which I believe is the same brand of volleyball that Wilson is. So he's on, his tooth is really hurting him, and he's coming to the realization that if he doesn't solve this problem of having a toothache, then he is, probably going to die. Something bad is going to happen because of this tooth. So he's using these ice skates, and, he's using these ice skates again, solving problems and functional fixedness and all that stuff. Using the ice skates as axes and rope the laces to do other things with it. And then he uses it also as a mirror, and he's looking at his tooth initially, and he realizes, okay, I need to knock this thing out. So he is, he's in the cave, and he's using the ice skates as a mirror. And, he has this rock, and he has this, ice skate pressed up against his tooth, and anyone who's gone through dental work probably is cringing at this moment, and it's one of the reasons I love to watch this movie in class. And he's counting off. He's like 1, 2, and then he whacks the end of that skate and pops out his tooth, and kind of knocks himself out because he falls down and hits his head. And it's a great transition point in the movie too, between newbie Chuck on the island and seasoned Chuck on the island. Because I think mentally it's this idea that, hey, if I'm going to survive on this island, I have to do this. I have to do stuff that I didn't think I was ever going to have to do, like perform my own dental work. And by doing that, I can be a survivor. Ultimately, it's a scene that I love watching in a crowd of other people, because some people are covering their eyes and turning away, and it's just a great social moment. I've always liked those kind of moments within movies. Ultimately, I think the scene really represents this change in his mind, where he says, and I just kind of said this, but if I'm gonna do this, if I'm gonna survive, I'm gonna have to do some stuff on this island that I didn't think I'd ever have to do.
Yeah, it is a really gnarly scene. Cringe, definitely cringe. I don't think anybody, even if they've never had significant dental work before, is going to be like, yeah, no, that's not a problem. They're not going to be like that. They're going to be like, you are sticking a dirty ass skate in your mouth and you're going to bang it with a rock. This sounds like a great idea.
Yeah. It sounds like a brilliant way to solve this problem.
Exactly. Sounds like a real brilliant way to solve this problem. Not enough salt water in the world to fix that abscess. That's for sure. Yeah,
no, definitely not.
And you had one other, I guess I would call it a well-planted Easter egg, I suppose. Nah, maybe not an Easter egg, but a well-planted visual storytelling at the beginning of the film. Do you want to explain that as well?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. This is one of those things I probably didn't catch the first, 8 or 9 times that I watched this film, but one of those very early scenes, opening scenes, they're panning through his office, and they're showing him with, all this stuff that demonstrates that he is someone who knows how to sail, that he has skills that eventually will come into play for him. And I think it's a neat way to kind of, without ever saying it, without saying, hey, Chuck is a survivor or Chuck knows how to sail, but gives you the information that he has the tools to get off this island. And it's really there if you pay attention, but man, I missed it for a large number of times that I watched this movie. This is just, it's, it's stuff like this that I love in movies because you catch them because, this is one of those movies that, for example, was on cable TV all the time. And, it's a great movie to grade to because I can jump in and just continue on with whatever I'm doing. And every time I see it, there's stuff that I see that I hadn't caught before that adds to the storytelling that goes on in this movie. The stuff they show are things like him on different sides of the sailboats, from small ones to big ones, and him receiving accolades for his sailing ability and certificates of sailing. All of that just builds into this persona of who Chuck is and what skill set he brings to the island. Taking into context with what happens at the end of the movie, it really builds in this idea of why he's able to solve this problem, because he has these skills that we don't even know, that there's never really said out loud, but which he clearly has. I think this is a great aspect of this movie just in terms of the filmmaking, because sometimes those expositions like Chuck saying, I'm a great sailor, and saying that out loud and purposeful kind of makes it clunky and kind of takes away from the realism of probably how this would go down. And I just think it's a great example of how to make a good movie. Ultimately just, good foreshadowing and good use of storytelling just to create a good movie, a great movie. And if you're paying attention, you catch those just regularly throughout.
I would definitely agree, both with the filmmaking technique and the fact that it is technically foreshadowing. It was, as we discussed in the Clockwork Orange episode with Wind, that it's better to show than tell. And I wanted to mention this last in that episode too. I'm an avid watcher of the YouTube channel CinemaSins, and they're everything wrong with insert film here, and consistently a sin in these films is too much exposition. So much so that, and there's so much exposition that they all get different names depending on what rhymes with exposition, or not rhymes with, but what fits with exposition. So sales position. We don't need to know, or Chuck doesn't need to tell everyone like, I'm an awesome sailor. It probably fits with his character that he's a sailor, and knowing, and that fitting probably with the time thing. I don't know too much about sailing, so I don't want to say more than that. But I think it fits with his character when we first meet him, which is, you're this clock is yours, live and die by this clock. And it's quite interesting. This was, I had a couple of notes that I wanted to add to, with the timepiece. That is a pun, because one of the features of the film is that he has a pocket watch from Kelly. So the timepiece. He has that throughout the film with him on the island, and that's his way of keeping Kelly with him. And it's broken. The clock doesn't work anymore. And so all he has is this keepsake and no more time, which is the entire theme of the film, essentially. And the other note that I had about this film is the end. Not the very end, but when he returns to civilization, FedEx throws a big old party for him. Please don't sue us party. Not explicit, but he does have to meet with lawyers. And they throw a big party for him. And at this party, when everybody's leaving, one guy says, "Hey, we should go fishing sometime." Wow, way to be a real jerk. And And then everyone leaves and they're panning over the food dishes, and they had crab and other fancy foods. And it's like, yo, he ate crab for 1,500 days. Do you think he wants crab? Probably not. Give him a big fat juicy cheeseburger or something. Oh my goodness. Oh, there was sushi there too. I was like, wow, straight savage these people were. They're like, you know what he would like in his transition back to civilization? The things that he was trying to escape from.
Yeah, I know. That's I love that part of the movie too, because it's so, you know, inappropriate in so many ways, what they provide. And, you know, he just wants ice. You know, on the plane ride home, he asks for 2 cups of ice and 1 drink. And that's what he wants. He wants stuff he didn't have.
Right. Exactly. Which should tell you, like, he wants the things that he missed the most. You know, people and things. He wanted the ice, and he's like, man, I love ice. He had no way to make ice for 1,500 days. And then FedEx throws him a party with crab, sushi, and a jackass that says, "Hey, let's go fishing."
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the fishing line and the fishing guy, because I hadn't caught that until today when I watched the end of that movie. And I was watching the end of it at the end of my class while students were working in the computer lab. And I'm actually mentioned that to my teaching assistant, you know, just like, you know, talking about this guy, like, hey, let's go fishing. And it's just, yeah, it's funny. It makes me laugh. It's one of those things, again, you notice when you watch this movie over and over again.
The guy also does the real hand gesture, like reeling in. I'm like, bro, he didn't actually have a fishing pole while stranded on a deserted island.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I'm sure Chuck could fish them all under the table with his spears.
He totally would. He would definitely. Alrighty. I think that's going to do it for this episode. Mark, I want to thank you for joining me to talk about Castaway. I hope you learned something, listeners out there. I certainly did. Please like and subscribe to this podcast. And if you have a few extra dollars laying around, please support our process here. We are a grassroots, crowdfunded, podcast. Mark, go ahead and say goodbye to everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And, I enjoyed this movie, and I hope you all enjoy it. And I could talk about it any day of the week.
Thank you, Dr. Marc Klippenstine, for joining me to discuss Castaway. I am excited to rewatch this now again with perhaps assign it in my classes. Until the next episode, thanks for listening.